there was my 2.5-second break. And on to the next one. Compression versus encryption. These are two different concepts. Compression is used to make files smaller. Encryption is used to obscure the contents of a file, usually hidden by a password or key. And they work together, hand in hand often. So a zip file, you can encrypt a zip file so nobody can access the zip file unless they have the password or they have, government level supercomputers to crack your encryption, depending on what encryption that you use. But encryption is somehow scrambling the ones and zeros of the computer file in such a way that it can be unscrambled exactly the way it was. So encryption is always lossless. You have to be able to unencrypt and get your original file back. Now, you can encrypt a lossy file, but the encryption part is lossless. So for example, if I have a personal image, I took a JPEG photograph and it's private and I don't want anybody else to be able to see it on my computer, I could put it in a zip file and encrypt it. Now the JPEG file is a lossy compression. It's been compressed with a little bit of loss of information, but now it's also been encrypted in such a way that nobody can look at it unless they have the password. They have to unscramble the ones and zeros, and the encryption is based on some sort of key. And so you can combine these two concepts of encryption and compression to not only save space, but also be secure. And there are many, many different encryption algorithms. You're probably using it all the time without even knowing it. There's encryption algorithms in your phone, in your Wi-Fi. Anything you do on a computer, if it's got a password, there's some kind of encryption going on. Some encryption methods are extremely minimal protection where anybody with beginner's level knowledge in encryption can bypass your encryption and see what you've tried to hide. Other ones can be extremely secure. Government level security, military level security. And there is military level security stuff available to consumers. Although you never know how secure it is in the long run. Right now, there's a lot of talk about some very interesting things happening on computer technology with what are called quantum computers. If anybody cracks the code, or when anybody cracks that code and develops these quantum computers, any security system we use today, or almost any, would be hackable pretty easily because these computers are so powerful that you would be able to get around a password with just brute force. So, encryption examples, I mentioned zip as a compression, but also an encryption. It not only compresses the file for size, but it encrypts it. Another thing, pretty good privacy, or PGP. Pretty good sounds like, it's all right, it's okay. It's actually really, really strong. And it is used by people who are going to share files, primarily email and other file sharing situations. And so what you do is you have a private key and a public key. And so for example, let's say I have my private key, it's mine, nobody knows my password, my private key. And I have a public key that only, I have a public key that I can share with anybody in the entire world. Doesn't matter that anybody knows my public key. So somebody wants to send something to me. They encrypt it with my public key. But to unlock it, you need my public and my private key together. So even though somebody else can encrypt it, they encrypt it just for me. The public key will only allow it to be unlocked if I give it my private key. And it sounds kind of confusing, but it works very well, but you've got to set it up. You've got to have a public key and private key. You've got to put your public key out there, send your public key to somebody so they can encrypt a file for you, for your eyes only. And so because it's not something you can just send to anybody and you have to share keys, not as many people use PGP or these public key systems. It's used a lot in business. So I know I'm going to be sending information back and forth with my law firm to all of my attorneys in my law firm and the legal aids and stuff. Great, I can use PGP because we know we work together. We know the system, we've learned the system, we can share each other's public keys, and it's a very secure system. Been a lot of talk over the last 20 years about these PGP systems. They're everywhere, and people have tried to keep them out of certain countries to crack down on the ability of criminal activity, terrorists, and other people using these very strong encryption systems, but they're out there in the wild. And some of these systems are really, 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 really good. And that's why the law enforcement and military sometimes freak out about them. Anyway, disk encryption, there are things like BitLocker, File Vault, TrueCrypt, etc. And you can encrypt your backups where you've got a backup storage of your file, but your backups aren't any good if you can't unencrypt them. And if any encrypted file gets even a little bit screwed up, sometimes you can't unencrypt it. Whereas an uncompressed, unencrypted file gets kind of screwed up, you sometimes can save it. You frequently can somehow salvage the file or most of the file. So when disks go bad, they can take down your data, but you have a chance of recovering it. When disks go bad and you're using compression and encryption, it generally takes your files with it. Again, you need good backup systems. But certainly the encryption has huge data security advantages. And as I just mentioned, data recovery is the disadvantage. You've got to have a good backup plan in place. There are holes in any security system. Sometimes when you're opening a file, there are pieces of your file or the entire file kept in what's called a temporary file, or what's also called a page file. A page file is a piece of your hard drive being used almost like a whiteboard for the computer. And this page file, or this extra space, this empty space on your hard drive being used as a whiteboard, can have all kinds of information. All of your secret encrypted information is decrypted, written to temporary files, written to the page files, and there it is for anybody to see if they ever get a hold of your computer, if they know what they're doing. And so if you really have truly important encrypted data, you need to understand these things and how do your programs work? How does your page file work? How does the temporary files work? And make sure that those are being either encrypted also or being wiped. And when I say wiped, you don't just delete the file, you literally write over it in a mixing pattern of random ones and zeros, or patterns of ones and zeros, like 8 times over, to just obliterate the information in your page file and temporary files. But you got to know what you're doing to do that. So encryption isn't perfect. It's good enough for the average user, but you're leaving breadcrumbs unless you really know what you're doing. You're always leaving breadcrumbs of your data in these other files. So that is data compression and encryption. And I just want to give you a quick example of something before I leave here. And so for example, here is some last video files, intermediate Excel MP4, number 1, 2, and 3, and the intermediate Excel audio versions of those files. Together, if I look at all of those files, they are, well, they're already compressed. I shouldn't use that. Let me go to something else. I want to use something that's not compressed. So here's a set of files. And I've got 8 selected files in my ABT57 folder. And in those 8 files, I have 365 kilobytes of information. Not very much information. Barely more than 1/3 of a megabyte. So these are small files. But that doesn't matter. Oops, what was the size again? .365. Don't worry, the size on disk counts some unused space. So 365 is the total. 365 days a year. So now I'm going to choose WinZip, and I'm going to add or move these to a zip file. Now I have WinZip installed. I could just say create a compressed folder if I was in Windows without WinZip installed. I also have WinRAR installed. I could have used WinRAR. And so here's my, reminder, it's out of date, whatever. I don't care that it's out of date. I don't need a new file. So here's my zip file name. So this is just a test zip file. And I'm going to add those files to test.zip. And what started out as 365 kilobytes was compressed only to 333. They were small files. They were somewhat already compressed files, so they didn't compress that well. But I did get 31.75%, or excuse me, 31.75 kilobytes, or a 9%, almost 10% savings in space. It's not too bad. But now, there's my test.zip file. If I wanted to send those files to anybody in email, all I have to do is attach that one file. And when I hover above it, you can see all of those files, all of those 8 files are inside, and I open it up. Sometimes, depending on your computer, it might look like it's opening up in a folder. In WinZip, it's actually opening up in the program. And so here's the WinZip program, and I can extract or uncompress any one file and pull it out of the zip file once I get it. But each of these individual files, or all 8 of them, I could take out of the zip file without changing the zip file. I'm just taking a copy out of the zip file. And then they are uncompressed and can be viewed, edited, whatever. If they're in the zip file, sometimes they can be read directly in the zip file, sometimes they can't. This one can. WinZip allows you to open files that are in the zip without actually taking them out. One of the things that I like about WinZip, you can actually open files while they're in the zip, if you have WinZip installed. And there's lots of other things. There's 7-zip and many different file programs that read WinZip files, including WinRAR, that also handles zip files. And I think WinZip handles like 25 different compressions, not just zip. So again, lots and lots and lots of ways to compress, but those are just some of the advantages of using a zip program. delete that. And if I wanted to send one of my colleagues the entire class, ABT 57 class, I could do the entire folder, add or move to a zip file. I selected this entire folder and I could zip it up, put it on a Google Drive, and somebody could then take it off the Google Drive themselves. Pretty slick. And very, very useful in many cases. Encryption and compression.